Okay, so today I want to talk about the basic concepts of the six psychological modes. And this is one of those frameworks that's kind of important to understand because a lot of other materials frame through it. So let me just kind of go through them in order. First, biological, biogenic. The biogenic mode is really about physiology. Very simple, very straightforward. Physiology, anything about the brain chemistry, the way the body interacts with the brain, basically how our biology responds to our mind and vice versa. Let's talk about the hypothalamus, which I don't need to explain in a great deal of detail. The hypothalamus is this little organ inside the brain which processes memory. So you can perceive things and understand things, but without the hypothalamus, it doesn't get moved into long-term memory. So if your hypothalamus is damaged, it's in some way or another, it makes it much harder, if not impossible, to retain new memories. You can still access all your old memories. You can still experience events and understand them, but you don't retain them. The movie Memento, if any of you have seen it, uh, disturbing movie, very violent movie. So if you want to check it out, just be warned, it's got a lot of pretty unpleasant stuff in it, but it's also a really fascinating story that talks about damage to the hypothalamus, that talks about long-term memory loss, just to throw out an example. Um, okay, psychoanalytical. Freudian therapy is the foundation of psychoanalytical therapy. Psychoanalytical therapy is founded on the idea of a developmental principle. What that means is that Freud believes that as you're growing up, you have to go through these different stages. If you fail to complete them, then you're going to be dealing with them in much worse ways down the line. In other words, if you don't meet the challenges, and really by the time you're age 5, these are all supposed to have been completed. So in Freud's idea, you have to go little by little to get to the right stage and take that information, process it, and move past whatever conflict involves that stage, and then move on. If you don't do this, then you repress something, you don't deal with it, and it becomes a problem down the line. Freudian therapy, for example, if you don't deal with a conflict with your father or your mother, that's a proper type of developmental issue, because that's just the way, in Freud's mind, that's the way things work. You have to have conflicts with your family and with adult figures, with authority figures. If you don't process those conflicts properly, then you end up not doing the work you need to develop, and it becomes repressed down the line. So an example of Freudian therapy is that, or Freudian theory, is that claustrophobia is caused not by having had a bad experience of being locked in a closet as a child, but actually by having a bad experience of having to repress something. You feel anger or hatred towards one of your parents. You can't acknowledge this, so it manifests itself as a phobia of some sort, as feeling trapped, so it's symbolic. And that's another key thing about psychoanalytical therapy, is that it is extremely symbolic in its nature. Okay. Behavioral. So we talked about biological, psychoanalytical, and I'm not reading off notes, so I just have to kind of run through this in my head. Okay. Behavioral. Behaviorism, true behaviorists don't care why you do something. They care about it. It's very mechanistic. They care about the ability to manipulate behavior and change it. So from a mechanistic point of view, from a behavioral point of view, you want to know what you can do to stop a child from biting another child. From behavioral therapy, you're going to say, let's say that Bobby is biting all his classmates. That's not behavior we want to encourage. So you want to use operant conditioning to reduce that behavior. So you introduce a punishment. In behavioral therapy, when we talk about punishment, we mean anything that's designed to decrease a given behavior. So, simply put, you might say, that the child gets a timeout whenever he's caught biting somebody. The child is sent or does not get a snack whenever he bites another classmate. Some people believe that the option is to spank a child. So if you believe that, then that's a form of punishment as well, as long as the point is to decrease the behavior. Very mechanistic. It's not about thinking about what the child believes about biting, whether the child has some repressed issue, whether the child has any physiological problems of some sort. It's just about how do we change it? What do we do to manipulate this behavior? Okay. Cognitive. Cognitive is entirely about the brain and about the thought process. So if you've got a child that's constantly biting another child, the cognitive therapist wouldn't want to say, well, what if we just slap the child every time that he's caught biting somebody? What if we do this punishment? What if we do this thing to modify the behavior? The cognitive therapist would want to say, what does biting mean to this child? What does it represent? What does the child think is happening when he bites another child? Does the child feel threatened by other children? Does he believe that he'll be less threatened if he bites? Does he believe that the child, does the child believe that there's something to be gained from biting? And so the question is to really look into and figure out what the thought process is there. Humanistic. Humanistic therapies are really about your sense of self and your belief in yourself and what it means. So to a humanistic psychologist, such as Maslow would be one example, Carl Rogers would be another one. Carl Rogers developed something called client-centered therapy. For those of you who take an intro psych before, this should ring true for you. This should sound a little bit familiar. What Rogers would do would really think about what the client needs in terms of sense of self, in terms of one's own understanding of the world around them. So, simply put, what is meaningful about the biting? When a child is biting, what is it that's being repressed in the child? What is it that's being held back that causes that child to act out in a way that doesn't serve them? So the idea is that there's something going on that's causing that child to bite that, of course, from a social standpoint, from all other standpoints, is unacceptable. But the child thinks it's gaining something, or it thinks there's something it wants and it's not getting, so it reacts in frustration and does something inappropriate. We'll talk more about all of these down the line. The sixth and final one is sociocultural. It's all built around the idea that we are human beings that interact with other human beings. So our behavior, our attitudes, our ideas are shaped by the world around us. It's a very nurture-oriented theory versus a nature-oriented theory, as we've been discussing from time to time. So when we talk about sociocultural therapies, we're talking about therapies like group therapy that look at people having similar problems and trying to interact and help one another. We look at things like grief counseling for communities. We look at things that look at the broader sense of the world around the client. So if a client's depressed, is that because the client's got their own personal issues, or is it because the client is in a community which is somehow having problems? Is the depression about hopelessness because the client looks around and says, there's nothing out there for me? So it's really about community in broader sense. Okay. So those 6 concepts, I'm going to just mention them once more. Let's see if I can do them off the top of my head again. Biological, psychoanalytical, behavioral, cognitive, humanistic, and sociocultural. Those are concepts that you're going to want to have with any psych course you take from me, even if you don't use them a lot this semester, and some of you may very well. They're just important concepts to understand for basic understanding of psychology.